2024 is upon us, and seeing as how everyone seems to be acting as if we don't have a future to look forward to, we might as well again do an episode that delves into the past. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the return of TV Timeline. Yes, it's once again time to delve into the evolution of a specific character or franchise that has been made for TV multiple times over the years. And for this installment, it's time to look into the original Masked Rider himself. Not him! I'm talking about the man who fought for justice in the face of tyranny and corruption. The Fox himself, Zorro. Originally created by Johnston McCulley in 1919 with the story The Curse of Capistrano, that book's adaptation into a 1920 film called The Mark of Zorro inspired McCulley to eventually write more than 60 books about his masked vigilante character who fought to defend the common people from the oppressive Spanish military government that controlled California in the 1820s. In addition to those stories, the character was featured in 4 full-length films and 4 movie serials before 1950 alone. As of 2024, there have been more than 120 books, movies, TV shows, and radio dramas starring McCulley's creation. Zorro is without a doubt one of the original archetypes for what we now view as the modern-day superhero, clearly inspiring later characters such as the Lone Ranger and even Batman himself. With so many adaptations of the character, it might take years to go through them all, so we'll just focus on the most significant television adaptations. So let's get started with perhaps the most famous of them all, the Zorro TV show from the mouse-eared empire himself. The Zorro TV series, created by Walt Disney, premiered in 1957 on ABC. It ended up with a 2-year run on the network, and since then became one of their most rerun series, especially once they delved into cable TV, which we'll get to in a bit. Now, I should point out that I unfortunately have never read any of Johnston McCulley's original books, so whether or not any of the stories or supplementary characters we see here were directly taken from those books, I unfortunately can't say. Anyone watching who has such further information is welcome to comment, but for now, let's just see what Disney's Zorro was all about. We open our series in the year 1820, where Diego de la Vega is returning home to Hispanic-controlled California. He's been wondering just why his father requested he cut short his studies in Spain, until the captain tells him of how a corrupt comandante has been terrorizing the people of Los Angeles. And all I can think of throughout this exposition is just how long of a journey it must have taken back then to sail all across the Atlantic and then travel on land completely across the American continent. Maybe I shouldn't be complaining about present-day air travel as much as I do. Diego confides in his mute manservant Bernardo that against such a foe as this comandante and his forces, a direct confrontation would be futile. So he immediately sheds all evidence that he had become a great fighter and athletic while in Spain to disguise himself as being a weak scholar, while Bernardo chooses to pretend he can't hear as well as not speak. If you think Diego's type of disguise sounds familiar, well, we'll be getting there. Diego finally returns to Los Angeles and sees for himself what his father was hinting at. Capitan Monasterio is running the pueblo as a dictator, with his orders usually carried out reluctantly by Sergeant Demetrio Lopez Garcia. He even goes to imprison those who speak against him, but is clearly selective in doing so, arresting a more common man like Nacho Torres, but so far has left alone Diego's very prominent father, Don Alejandro. Diego continues to carry out his act of not being willing to directly confront the Comandante, which greatly disappoints his activist father, but in doing so, allows Diego to create his second, much more prominent secret identity. Thus, with the aid of Bernardo and his horse Tornado, the newly christened Zorro is able to break Torres free from the Comandante's imprisonment and send him to shelter, ending the pilot episode. The first thing I will point out is that upon my original watching of the series, I was very impressed by the story structure. The series actually follows the structure of old movie serials, divided into individual story arcs of about 13 episodes each. The first season is actually split into 3 such arcs. The first one centers around Zorro working to protect Torres until the courts find him and eventually Alejandro innocent of such treason, while continuing to thwart the rest of Monastario's plans. And Monastario, to his credit, is no dummy. The first arc actually concludes with him deducing that Diego is Zorro and putting him on trial. It only fails because Bernardo crashes the trial himself dressed as Zorro, which finally leads to Monastario being exposed, arrested, and stripped of his command. The second arc is all about the Pueblo's struggles to find a comandante they can actually trust, while a supposed magistrate of the Spanish king arrives to help keep order. Only it turns out the magistrado is himself a turncoat, working for some agent that calls himself the Eagle. The second arc ends with the magistrado being revealed and killed himself, and the people of Los Angeles hoping that they can now live in peace with a fair comandante. In the third and final arc of Season 1, we finally meet the Eagle and discover his whole operation is plotting to overthrow the entire government ruling over Los Angeles and supposedly turn over all of California to some other unnamed country. Did Walt Disney secretly make the United States a shadow villain for this thing as a way of doing penance for working with the House Un-American Activities Committee? Which, yes, brings us to the one unfortunate aspect of the series that cannot be avoided. This show is one of the worst cases of whitewashing imaginable, given that almost every role of a supposedly Hispanic character is played by a gringo. Diego de la Vega is played by Guy Williams, who would go on to play Dr. John Robinson on Lost in Space. Bernardo was played by Gene Sheldon, while Sergeant Garcia is played by Henry Calvin. You may recognize Sheldon and Calvin as having played Rodrigo and Gonzorgo in the Disney adaptation of Babes in Toyland. This continued into the later episodes, where the Magistrado is played by Vinton Hayworth, who would go on to play General Schaefer on I Dream of Jeannie. They did recruit Cesar Romero for one brief role, but the guest star list also included future $6 Million Man star Richard Anderson, Guy Williams' future Lost in Space co-star Jonathan Harris, and even Annette Funicello herself. And keep in mind, these are just the actors I myself recognize. Obviously, you could get away with this more due to the show being originally in black and white, but given that later reruns were colorized, yeah, it doesn't make Disney's history of diversity look that good, not even for the time. Still, the show did maintain decent ratings, even into the second season, despite the writers kind of going all over the place there. Relocating Diego to Monterrey to start the season, and then going out and revealing Don Alejandro actually knew his son was Zorro for a long time. Despite those clear jump the shark moments, it seems what actually led to the show's end were legal disputes between Disney and ABC over who actually retained the rights to the show, as well as to the Mickey Mouse Club and the anthology series that would eventually become known as The Wonderful World of Disney. During the dispute, the old episodes were repackaged into 4 TV movies that they aired in order to help retain the rights to the series. The original episodes would go on to be a staple on the Disney Channel from its inception in 1983 all the way until 2002. And to be honest, there definitely are reasons why the show has endured for so many years. If you can get past the whitewashing, the stories themselves and those who portray the characters are still pretty good. The show is pretty impressive at covering long-running story arcs at a time when television shows were still very episodic. The full series was added to Disney Plus in 2023, so you're absolutely welcome to check it out for yourself. Now, it's here we must do something we've never done before on TV Timeline and go out of chronological order in covering each series. Why must we do that? Well, believe it or not, there actually was a direct sequel series to the Disney Zorro. Zorro and Son was also produced by Disney and aired on CBS in 1983. Even going so far as to use a slightly updated version of the classic George Bruns and Norman Foster produced theme song, while splicing in shots from the title sequence from the first series. And let's just say there are reasons no one is begging for this series to get put on Disney Plus anytime soon. First is the fact that none of the original cast returned for this new series, and I'll get to who plays Zorro here in a bit. The second is, well, there really isn't an easy way to put it. This series, which again is a direct sequel to a show that reflected serial dramas from the 30s and 40s, is a straight-up sitcom!
Zorro will want to know of this.
The opener of the very first episode shows us old Diego still as Zorro, choosing not to risk his body and taking the stairs instead of leaping off of them, and then insulting the Comandante not about his failure to gain respect among the people, but about his name.
My blade is at your disposal, Capitan. Pico Paco. That's Paco Pico.
They even have an actual laugh track, and they give the Comandante a sidekick that, let's just say, Sergeant Garcia would want to slap in the face.
The curse of Capistrano. I believe, my Capitan, if you boil the water before drinking, you will not catch it.
That is the revenge of Montezuma, not the curse of Capistrano. The curse of Capistrano is Zorro. The scourge of the Camino Real.
The scourge of Camino Real. I once picked up a bad case of the scourge on leaving San Francisco.
Let's just be glad this thing was made 40 years ago, or they might have thrown in flatulence! So by the title alone, you can probably guess what this show is all about. Diego is having to come to terms with the reality that he can't be Zorro forever, and thus has to take on his estranged son as a protege. And again, it's not taken anywhere close to seriously.
You must never be seen dressed together like this again.
Yes, Father.
Oh, and one more thing. Next time I kiss the girl, you hug the monk.
Imagine if, when Batman Beyond was made, Will Friedle was actually asked to portray his character as if he was Eric Matthews! It doesn't help that this show doesn't do a good job explaining exactly when it takes place. The original was set in 1820, which means there would only be about a 25-year window before California got caught up in the Mexican-American War, which this show doesn't really ever talk about. So, at what point in time did Diego decide it was okay to father a child while still running around as a masked vigilante? And no, we never find out who the kid's mother is either. The show makes me flat out wonder if its writers even actually watched the first series. Why do I say that? Because of one teeny tiny break in continuity from its predecessor, Bernardo can talk! What the everlasting frack!
Really think that someday Carlitos could be man enough to fit my tights?
Diego, you can no longer fit your tights. I mean, just last night I had to let them out again.
It really doesn't look good when you come off being as ignorant of the show you're following up on as the writers of I Still Dream of Jeannie! It probably won't surprise you that this series only lasted 5 episodes. It was clearly a rushed, poorly thought out product that Disney put together during one of the company's leaner times in a desperate attempt to prove that they were still the originators of bringing this legendary character to television. Why do I say that? Well, here's where going out of order comes in. See, this series came out 2 years after there was another attempt to bring Zorro back to the small screen by our old friends at Filmation!
The mark of Zorro! Zorro!
Yes, the company responsible for He-Man and the original Ghostbusters made their own animated version of the Hispanic Masked Marauder that premiered on CBS Saturday mornings in 1981. It was clearly part of Lou Scheimer's attempt to adapt pretty much all of the classic Pulp Fiction stories as it aired alongside cartoon adaptations of Tarzan and the Lone Ranger. That still makes more sense than making a cartoon out of Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley. Watching this thing, I can say something for sure. This is definitely a Filmation cartoon. Title sequence loaded with exposition? Check. Flashy transition cards that can be used over and over? Check. Closing sequence meant to edumacate the kiddies? You best believe that's a check. Other than that, it's pretty much what you would expect. Have you seen any superhero cartoons from the 60s throughout the 80s? That's this thing with Zorro. Much more episodic than the previous show, to the point where I doubt I could even figure out the original order of them. The Comandante and his troops come up with a new way to cheat and steal from the peons. Zorro thwarts their plans. Zorro rides away in the end. Lather, rinse, repeat. Still, the cartoon does look like it was clearly inspired by the first Disney series. They even have their own version of Sergeant Garcia, even if he has a new name here. Again, it's possible that such characters existed in the original stories that I haven't read myself, but given that by now Walt's show probably had the most influence on pop culture, make of that what you will. And there's little doubt Disney created Zorro and Son in direct response to Filmation's little cartoon endeavor. How do I guess this? Because Henry Darrow plays Diego de la Vega on both of these shows. Hey, at least with him, they finally cast an actor of Latino descent. Still, neither of these shows could really step out of the shadows of the first, and it seemed like not one ever would. And then, in 1990, The Legend of Zorro was brought back to television with a new series that premiered on the Family Channel, produced by Roger Corman's production company New World Pictures, whose television credits do include The Wonder Years, Sledgehammer, and Tales from the Crypt, and even at one time helped produce The Bold and the Beautiful and Silk Stalkings. Clearly Mr. Corman was willing to make a wide variety of productions, so would adapting El Zorro for Pat Robertson's channel be as successful as Disney's series, or as bad as the Maniac Mansion show? This series does come off more like the Dukes of Hazzard than any Robin Hood movie serial. Like the previously mentioned cartoon, it's much more episodic and doesn't seem to have any major story arcs involved. There was a 4-parter that delved into this version's origin story that, if the online episode guides are correct, began with the 8th episode of the first season. I have yet to find any info as to if those episodes were originally some type of pilot movie, But it seems there was a pilot episode that looks like it's not considered to be in canon, because in it, Diego's servant Felipe can talk, but for the rest of the actual series, he's a mute just like Bernardo was. Kind of like what Zorro and Son did in reverse, and pulled off much better. And believe me, I mean it when I say this thing is very much episodic. Remember, in the first series, Don Alejandro was arrested for treason midway through the first arc, only for he and Torres to be acquitted when Zorro thwarted the attempts of the Comandante's corrupt judges. In this series, the Alcaide arresting Alejandro is what drives Diego to become Zorro, who springs Alejandro from jail, and that's it! It's as if the Alcaide can't come up with a reason to just arrest Alejandro again! See what I mean about this being more like the Dukes of Hazzard? This series was clearly made to have a more romantic spin on it, introducing the first full-time female character for a Zorro series in Victoria, who clearly is meant to fill a Lois Lane type persona, clearly having the hots for Zorro while showing contempt for Diego's supposed lack of courage. Other than that, the format is very much like that of the previous shows. Diego de la Vega takes on the persona of Zorro to battle the corrupt military politicians controlling the pueblo of Los Angeles, whose deeds must usually be carried out by a less than intelligent sergeant who actually develops great respect for Zorro, even if his job requires him to try and catch the fox and unmask him, which he of course never succeeds at. Once again, the series does look like it had some inspiration from the Disney show. Duncan Regere's portrayal as Diego does bear a striking resemblance to Guy Williams, and yes, this is sadly another case of casting a gringo in the role. Though for what it's worth, the entire series was filmed in Spain, and they at least have Patrice Martinez as Victoria. And while Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. plays Don Alejandro originally, he was replaced after the first season with Henry Darrow. Guy found a niche to hang on to in this franchise, give him props for that. Of course, I'll get comments out the wazoo if I don't mention the episode. The second season premiere titled The Wizard, where Diego meets up with an American scientist named Dr. Henry Wayne, played by Adam West. Yes! This show suggests that not only did Zorro really exist in Batman's universe, but the real Zorro met with Bruce Wayne's ancestor. How do you manage to canonize what basically looks to be someone's fanfiction and pull it off so brilliantly? What has since become known as the new Zorro has definitely turned into a cult classic, as the DVD sets currently go on the resale market for about $170. Though it is streaming for free on the Roku channel service as of this video's posting. Just be aware, this show can get really cheesy. Maybe even more than Walt's show from the 50s. But in a way, that's exactly what this franchise is supposed to be. From what I can see and tell, Zorro was never meant to be a deadly serious drama. Like many other pulp stories of the time, it was always a cheesy action series, with a protagonist who delighted in not just beating his foes, but embarrassing them, often winning with brains over brawn. Maybe Zorro and Son went too far on the comedic side, but both the first Disney series and the 90s series seemed to find a good balance between plots that had some level of gravity to them, but still allowed for levity when the story allowed it. That above all else makes for a really good cult series, and that's exactly what something like Zorro is meant to be. Of course, this wasn't the end for the character being adapted. At least 2 more animated series have been produced since then, one made by Fred Wolf Pictures of all people. There were plans in 2019 to make a modern retelling with a female Zorro that would have aired on the CW, but it never made it off the ground. In late 2021, it was announced that Disney would produce a new series starring Wilmer Valderrama in the title role. That show is still in development. However, a new series was completed in the past couple years and was just released on Amazon Prime as of our video's posting. From what I've seen so far, it may be the first Zorro TV series fully produced by and starring Hispanics, with the Amazon release clearly having been dubbed into English. Which is probably why that series has gotten pretty much zero promotion from Amazon at all. But hey, they'll definitely let you know you go to them to tune into the worst NFL game of each week on Thursday. Happy 2024 from us at TV Trash.